You're listening to the Finchwood Discipleship Podcast. My name is Matthew, and as your host, my mission is to help you discover who God is and what it means to live as a citizen of His kingdom. Greetings, Finchwood. What you're currently listening to is the 20th episode of the Finchwood Discipleship Podcast to be released. That places it chronologically between seasons 2 and 3. However, I'm listing it as a part of season 1 because, in many ways, it's a follow-up to the intro episodes. Speaking of that, originally I had listed the first 3 episodes as season 0 and the first full season as season 1, but I changed the numbering later on, so please don't be confused if you keep listening and you hear me refer to season 2 as season 1 while it's going on. I promise that once you get to season 3, the numbering will be a lot more consistent and all of that madness will be behind us. Anyway, this episode came about as a result of lots of conversations I've been having with other people during the process of making this podcast. We've been talking about why many of them aren't currently following Jesus. When I first started Finchwood, as I mentioned in the pilot, the idea was to provide an explanation of Christianity that starts from square one, as if you, the listener, know nothing about God. Basically, I was starting with a blank slate, and to that point, Season 2 is a great foundation for any genuinely blank slates who may be out there, so I do feel like I've accomplished that part of the task. However, what I've found as I talk to more and more people and hear their stories is that while there are certainly people who simply don't know anything about God and would love to know more, those individuals are relatively rare. The much more common place that I found people in is that they grew up in the church, learned a lot about the Bible and about Jesus, and even called themselves Christians at one time or another, but then something happened that caused these to no longer identify as believers. Or at the very least, they've made a lot of effort to distance themselves from those who do still identify as Christians. Now, if you're not in that camp, if you don't have any reservations about God or about His people, you may still get something out of this episode. I would urge you to keep listening, and I would also urge you to honestly listen to your unbelieving and especially ex-believing neighbors and friends. Hear their stories and take their critiques to heart. There are a lot of places where we can do better, but if we close ourselves off to the honest feedback and perspectives of outsiders, we won't know where our weak spots are. Blinding ourselves to every correction is the recipe for hypocrisy, so please do not go there. Now, on the other hand, if you, dear listener, do fit that description, whether you call yourself an ex-Christian, an apostate, a survivor, whatever term you use, I'd like to address you specifically for the next couple of minutes if I may. First of all, I want to thank you for coming this far. I know I'm always thanking people for listening, and a lot of that is just the polite thing that you say as a podcaster because you want your listeners to feel good after the episode, and you want them to feel like they have some kind of personal connection to you. But in this case, I need you to know that I really mean it. It takes a lot of guts to go through the kinds of church hurts, religious trauma, and spiritual abuse that many of you have probably faced. And to still be willing to even listen to a podcast about God and what it means to trust Him with your life, that's hard, and I really don't want to take it for granted. I'd also like to recognize that the nature of what happened to each of you to turn you away from your faith is certainly different for each person, and I have no intention of invalidating your experience by comparing them to other people's. The fact is that if you've been hurt by people calling themselves Christians, that's awful, and it shouldn't be the case. And I want to tell you that I'm sorry that we can be so bad at interacting with people and practicing the very things that we preach. Lately, the temptation for both of our positions has been to view the other as an enemy, and overcoming that from both sides is something I'm willing to commit to. One last thing I'd like to say here before we move on is that if you're in a bad church situation right now, do what you have to do to protect yourself. At a minimum, that means being able to set healthy boundaries between yourself and others, and in some cases it may mean getting out entirely. I know that's easier said than done in a lot of cases because relationships and people are always complicated, and I know some of you have employment concerns to work out, but please do what you have to keep yourself safe. I believe that God cares far more about our well-being than any of us realize, and He certainly places a higher priority on that than attendance or staying connected to some abusive system that He didn't intend for us to be in the first place. Along those same lines, I'm also a big fan of therapy for anyone who's experienced trauma or abuse of any kind. It's very likely even that some listeners should seek healing and even professional help before embarking on this journey that I'm about to talk to you about. There's no point in trying to walk on broken legs, so if you just need to bookmark this podcast as something you can listen to later on, please do so. And then when you're ready, please come back. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I do have to admit that I would love for you to eventually reconnect with the faith you once held. And if Finchwood can play some part in facilitating that, that would be great. At the same time, I don't want you to feel pressured in any regard. I fully recognize that some of you may go on this journey and genuinely commit to asking the hard questions and still come to the conclusion that Christianity is just not for you. I promise to respect that even where I disagree. If, and I emphasize if, you do choose to rejoin this faith, it has to be of your own accord. So I'm not going to push you, and if you ever do feel like you're being pushed, I want you to tell me because that means I'm not doing my job very well. I also would like to promise you that I meant what I said in episode 1 about asking questions and all topics being open for conversation. You should never believe or place your trust in anything that isn't open to scrutiny. Please continue to ask hard questions and know that you have permission within this space, within the Finchwood community, not only to express your hurts and your doubts, but also to demand better of us who still call ourselves Christians. Now, why am I bringing all of this up, and what does it mean for us moving forward? It seems like we can all agree something is very broken here, but we've all got very different ideas about how to fix it. There's been a trend over the past few years that you're probably aware of by now, in which people are deconstructing the faith that they grew up in. And I've come to believe that deconstruction is actually something that we need. It's not the big disaster that so many Christians have been making it out to be. The fine line between deconstruction and reformation is incredibly thin. Along those lines, though, a lot of the people I've known who have gone on these deconstruction journeys have ended up either hitting a dead end and getting stuck in their pain, or they came to cherish the questions and the doubts so much that they no longer had any place in their hearts for faith. A lot of them are rejecting all of Christianity because parts of it are broken. My dear friend Jonathan, who, by the way, has started making something called the Kingdom Adventure podcast, which is available on at least Spotify and probably a couple of other places, he made a great suggestion that really hit home for me during a late-night conversation a few months ago. He proposed that there's a middle way, a third option, in between rejecting Christianity altogether and uncritically accepting everything you've ever been told. I'm giving him the credit here because I just love the wording he came up with. He suggested that maybe what would do us the most good isn't deconstruction so much as it's distillation. Instead of dismantling everything, approaching it with knee-jerk skepticism that's based more on our pain than a search for truth, and then throwing out the proverbial baby with the bathwater, my goal here is to conduct a thorough inventory of everything that Christianity is about. Beliefs, culture, history, practices, all of it, and ask the hard questions. Is this true? Is it helping us or hurting us? Is this really Christianity? That's the journey that I'm asking you to accompany me on as we go forward. Would you be willing to discover with me that the Christianity and the Christians we've come in contact with are not a fair representation of what God is actually like, or even what His people can be like? To that point, I think the best strategy for accomplishing that is one that's still pretty close to the original purpose of this podcast. My job is still to present what biblical Christianity is. However, a lot of that is now going to mean differentiating between the Christianity of the Bible, the faith originally founded by Jesus and His immediate followers on the one hand, and on the other hand, the shallow, toxic Christianity that we so frequently see displayed in the world around us. Of those two, I believe the first is of the highest value, while the second is a poor, sick, sometimes even evil substitute. Making that crucial distinction is going to mean unlearning a lot of what we've been told is true about Jesus. Once we've distilled Christianity down to its essence, once we've gotten to the core of what it's really about, only then will it be safe for us to reconstruct our faith. Because then it won't be based on legalism or a personality cult, or the cultural trappings of Western society, or any of the other stuff that we so often mistake for Christianity. One idea that I'm presently toying with is also leveraging the other Finchwood social media accounts like Twitter and YouTube, which should both be linked in every episode's description, to address topics in this space, so please follow us in those locations. As far as where this podcast is going next, stay tuned for the next season to begin shortly. Remember to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, truly, genuinely, for listening.